Welcome everyone to another exciting class in Daniel and Daniel. And today we're looking at Daniel 6, Daniel Vav, which is of course the story of the lion's den. So very exciting for us. And we're going to look at the story itself, of course, some interesting parallels. There's actually a lot to talk about in this story, including what it tells us about prayer during this time period, and the way it contrasts the Persian kings with the let's say the Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian kings, if we compare it to chapter 3, to the story in chapter 3. So let's dive right in. Okay. All right. So here we have Daniel chapter 6. And we are now, if we go back to the end of 5, that ended with the end of Belshazzar, right? He's the Chaldean king, right? The Babylonian king. We talked last time about how Belshazzar, the historical Belshazzar, wasn't actually a king on his own. He was essentially a regent, but he did function as a king, and he was essentially and he was kind of at the end of the Babylonian Empire. Now remember that Belshazzar made Daniel one of the 3 ruling the kingdom, Talta b'Malchuta, this triumvirate that rules the kingdom. We don't know actually of a triumvirate that ruled in the kingdom, the Babylonian or the Persian kingdom, but this is carried on in our current story, where it's going to pick up with this idea that you have 3 people who are kind of in charge under the king. All right, now we go into Darius the Mede. Now, in the chronology of Daniel, you've got Darius the Mede before Cyrus the Persian, right? So we'll have like when we go, this just goes back, but when we go, so we have the Medes as a kingdom and then the Persians. Now, of course, the actual chronology is we have Cyrus and then Darius in the Persian Empire. But the way Daniel works is you have Darius the Mede, and then you have Cyrus later on. Okay, now here, V'dayavish Mada'a Kabel Machuta Kfar Shnin Shitin V'tartin, right? So he got the kingdom at 62 years old. I don't know why they're translating it 3 score. Like, let's make it harder to understand. That's a weird way to do it. But okay, 62 years old. Shtivar Kadam Daryavish Vakim al Mokuta Lachdar Panaya Ma'av Esrindi Levon B'chomachuta. And what's interesting here is that here it says, okay, so Darius set over 120 satraps. Now, he actually didn't set up that many satraps. Maybe it's looking at, there's this idea that there were 100. There always this very large number given of satraps, like in Jewish texts, like Esther, etc. Maybe they're thinking of small local satrapies. There really weren't this many. But Darius was in fact the one who set up this system of satrapies and the pecha, like to have a really defined system. Darius was in fact the one who set that up. So in that, this is reflecting that. So again, Daniel is one of these 3 people who are ruling under him. Essentially, you need these guys to count everything so that the king doesn't lose any taxes. All right, the king shouldn't get harmed in that he shouldn't not get what's due to him, right? His treasury should not be harmed, right? Edayin, Daniel dina mitnatzach al sarchaya v'chashtar pinaya. So Daniel, he makes himself, he's better essentially than everyone else who's in charge. Kol kavel diruch yatirabe umalka ashit lahakamute al kol malchuta. So why? Because he's got this extra spirit, right? Does this mean just that he's wiser, or that he has extra spirit because of God? It seems to hint that this is because he's divinely helped, right? And the king puts him over the whole kingdom. Okay, now this is never a good situation. You're just asking for trouble here. And in fact, trouble occurs. So what they want to do, what Sarchaya v'Chashtar Penaya, right? The satraps and the heads, these officers want to do is they're looking for an ilah, they're looking for something, there's of ilah, something that they can use to accuse Daniel of doing something to harm the kingdom, okay? But they couldn't find any accusation or any corruption that they could use against Daniel, right? He's a loyal guy, so they couldn't find anything. And you couldn't find either an error or actual misdoing on his side, right? So they've got nothing to accuse him of. Right now, this is actually, we have a lot of ancient Near Eastern texts that show this. There's a lot of I should say a lot, but there are absolutely, besides stories that are like this, where you have this one. What's one story I was just reading? I made a note of it. It's cited in an article by Van der Toorn, and now I can't. I'll tell you in just a minute what it's called. Maybe some of you know it. Ludlow. There's a story of Ludlow, which is, it's actually kind of a Jobian story. There's this advisor to the king. He gets diseased. He gets thrown out of the court, and everyone's against him. And then he kind of gets restored through Marduk. God gives him a dream that he's going to be restored, and he gets restored. But he talks very much of being kind of isolated, and everyone's against him, and no one's going to help him. And that's that we see from letters, also from different kind of people who were in advisory positions and were deposed because the king switched. That is the feeling that they get, like no one's going to help me, and everyone's kind of accusing each other in these courts. It's not surprising; it's politics, right? So everyone is kind of against each other. That's what's going on here. So we have Edain Guvraya Ilech Amrin Dila Nahashkach LeDaniel did not call Ilah Lahen Hashkachna Elohi Bedat Elahe, right? He said we can't find. So there's this whole conspiracy. They're like, we can't find anything against him, any sort of accusation we could bring against him, right? So let's find something that has to do with the law of his God, Bedat Elahe, with the law of his God. Right? Edain Sarchaya v'Chashtar Penaya Ilin Hargishu al Malka. So that these guys all went together in kind of a torrent, and kind of a fury, and kind of a, right? That's the word Hargishu, right? Hargishu, we do see it in Tehillim as related to a bunch of people going together. There does seem to be something, a note of like a conspiracy maybe in this word, but it means that they're going kind of in a tumultuous way to the king. So they approach him, they say, Darius, the king, may you live forever. All these leaders, everyone at every level of leadership. Malka, they've all consulted to present before the king. Right? That they should have, the king should establish a law, right? What's that law? In other words, no one should ask anything of any god or man for 30 days, right? And if they do, then they should be cast into the pit of lions. Gov actually means pit, to the pit of lions. So no one should, in other words, to show your might, no one should ask anything of any god or man for 30 days. Now, this is not something that has any sort of parallel in ancient Near Eastern law or occurrence. No king would dare, frankly. I mean, it's the sort of thing where, if I may, so let's stop my share for a second. So let me explain. like even when we talk about Akhenaten, right, the famous kind of monotheistic king where he sets up the Aten and everyone should worship the Aten, and really, but they're really worshiping the Aten through Akhenaten and Nefertiti, right? But they should worship the Aten, right? Even he, outside of Thebes, supports temples, other temples, right? Just not in Thebes, right? He wants to bring down the Theban priesthood, but he doesn't stop support for anyone who any king, even when they're building their own, they're supporting their own royal cult, or they want to create, worship of a specific god, they're not going to stop anything going to any of the other gods, because then you're going to have a much bigger revolt on your hands, right? So this is a very unusual kind of step to take, and the point of this step is to really force Daniel's hand. Like in the story, the reason for this step is because you really got to do something where you're going to get Daniel in trouble no matter what. And what's interesting here is that we don't do what we did in what we saw in chapter 3 in the story of Daniel's 3 friends, right? Remember, if the story in Daniel 3 doesn't have Daniel, right? It has his 3 buddies, and they're going to be forced to worship an idol, and they will not, right? And that's the issue. That is something that's very out there, and it's something that kind of you would be expected to have a problem with. This is something where, if you actually look at what's being asked, right, and the way they're presenting it, and we'll understand in a bit. Well, I can say now, it's setting it up because the king can't know that this is setting up Daniel, right? The way this narrative goes, whereas Nebuchadnezzar didn't care, right, about these Jewish guys and what kind of situation they were going to be in. Darius likes Daniel. He's made him important. So these advisors have to trick the king into setting a rule that's going to get Daniel in trouble without the king immediately thinking this is going to get Daniel in trouble, right? So they're not saying put up an idol, and he doesn't put up an idol. Realize how much softer this is than the story in chapter 3, right? The story in chapter 3 is like they're in court, and all of a sudden you're going to have to worship an idol, right? You don't worship an idol. They don't worship idol. Nebuchadnezzar gets really angry. He throws them into the fiery furnace, right? He wants them dead. That's not what goes on in this story. In this story, you've got a king who really likes Daniel, and you've got the advisors are all plotting against him. Okay, I'm going to take one question which I see came in. Let's see. So Robin said, as you said, the chronology is wrong with Darius coming before Cyrus. Does this tell us something about how and when the book was written? It does seem to indicate that there's a certain amount of length between the Persian period and this being composed. What we're going to see, particularly in chapter 6, is that it seems to be a reaction to the decrees of Antiochus. In other words, the sort of oppression it's talking about is you don't get to do your practice, as opposed to you must worship idols, right? Which is what was chapter 3, was you must worship idols. Here, what we're seeing is you cannot pray to your God, right? Which is much more in line with the Antiochus decrees. So in general, chapter 6 is considered to be much more in line with a reaction to the decrees of Antiochus Epiphanes. And that's how we can understand it. And that's how we can also understand this kind of misunderstanding of where Darius fits in the chronology. Because if you had the story going way back to Darius, no one would call Darius the Mede coming before Cyrus. At the same time, this story does reflect, and here I'm echoing Hartman and Dallela, it does reflect a knowledge of Persian law and bureaucracy, particularly bureaucracy, less law. Because like I said, with the idea that the way Darius is setting everything up, that bureaucracy is something that is Persian, and that reflects a certain reality. And of course, the reality, I always feel like whenever someone says, oh, well, this reflects the reality of jealousy in the court, I'm like, no doubt, like, excuse my, of course, you get a bunch of smart people, you put them in court, you say one of them have more power than the other. Of course, they're going to snitch on each other. Of course, they're going to have, you don't have to have deep knowledge of the court. Okay. All right, so what happens? So they say, okay, make this rule. They convince the king to make this rule that for 30 days, no one is going to pray to anyone, right? No one's going to pray. They're not going to ask anything from God or man. All right. Now, king established this kind of forbidden thing, and either write it down or sign it. It could be either. It could just be write it down, or this could actually be specifically to sign it, and that becomes important later. So that it can't be changed as according to the law of the Medes and the Persians. It can't be uprooted, it can't be taken away. What does this remind us of? Right? What does this rule remind us of? That a law can't be reversed.
Esther,
right? So in Esther, we have this idea that a law can't be reversed.
The whole thing is reminiscent of that.
Yes, the whole thing's reminiscent of Esther, continues to be reminiscent of Esther. The thing about the law not being reversed comes up again. The other place where you do see this rule, and I'm saying it now because it's going to come up later also, because the king dearly wants to change this law. And we actually have something from a Greek, the only other place besides that I know of, besides Esther and Daniel, we have a Greek historian who actually says this about Persians. Now, we don't have evidence of this from the Persians themselves. We have evidence from people talking about Persians. So Diodorus Siculus, also known as Diodorus the Sicilian, who was a Greek historian, writing from 30 to 60 CE. He tells a story. Let's see if I'll find this. He tells a story of someone who was, and now hold on just a moment, let me find it. Tells a story, 30, okay, here we are. All right. So he tells a story of a guy named Charidemus, right? And the king has him put to death, and Charidemus is like, you're gonna regret this, right? Okay. And so Charidemus's prospects had been high. I'm reading. Charidemus's prospects had been high, but he missed their fulfillment because of its ill-timed frankness, and he ended his life in this fashion. Once the king's passion had cooled, he promptly regretted his act and reproached himself for having made a serious mistake, but all his royal power was not able to undo what was done. He was haunted by dreams, etc., etc. Now, this is a little bit not quite saying you can't reverse a law, but it actually reminds us very much of the beginning of Esther, right? It reminds us of the beginning of Esther, where he put someone to death and then he's like, oh no, what have I done, right? But there's that idea of someone doing something in haste, a Persian king doing something in haste, then not being able to reverse it, all right? So that kind of theme. And that's what we're seeing here. So he's like, okay, quick, write it down so that it can't be reversed. So he, in fact, wrote it, and he created this rule. Daniel, this is important. Daniel knew that the writing was signed. He knew that this order had gone out, but nothing changed. He did not change his behavior, right? Just like under the decrees of Antiochus, you don't change your behavior. You know it's not allowed, but you still do what you need to do. He went into his house, and he went to the window in his attic opposite Jerusalem. And so he, 3 times a day, he blesses on his knees and he prays and thanks before God, just as he has been doing from before, right? Now, I know you guys are recognizing a lot of these actions. He's praying towards Jerusalem. He's praying 3 times a day, right? He's getting down on his knees, which is a little unusual. You do have like, if you look at in Ezra, here's an example where he says, I think it's here. No, it's not. So if you, here we are. This is a very specific instance where Ezra's talking about towards evening, he gets up from his fast because he's kind of repenting for what everyone else has done, right? He tears his clothing and he kneels down on his knees and he he spreads his palms to God, right? So that's a little bit more precise. Here he's talking about this is the way he prays, and he seems to pray on his knees. That's how he prays, which is a little unusual. This, or at least to us, it's a little unusual, but this does give us an indication of how people are praying, at least at the time this is being written, right? 3 times a day, this is how you're supposed to pray. Towards Jerusalem, 3 times a day. Why in the attic? Well, that is a quieter place. It's also a place where you could easily kind of dedicate to prayer. Like if that's where I pray. It's not a place that you need to use a lot. So we see it frequently cited as kind of a quiet place, a place to set aside. So it could be that could be why the attic, opposite Jerusalem. We have that in Melachim Aleph Chet, that 1 Kings chapter 8. This is in the dedication of the Beit HaMikdash by Shlomo, by Solomon. Okay, so in that dedication, and this chapter is considered academically. So you can say, oh, but look, this is proof that it's very, very early to pray towards Jerusalem. But our academics will always place this chapter to much later, to after the destruction. I believe to after the destruction, certainly to much later than the time of First Kings, right? Like the time of Solomon. But in this speech, but certainly traditionally it's from Solomon, right? And in this speech where Shlomo was talking about, here I've built a house, how should you act with this house, right? And he talks about here we are, right? He says, when the nation goes out against its enemy, but whichever way you send them out, el Hashem, you should pray to God through the city which you chose, which God chose, and through the house which I, Solomon, built for your God's name. Right? So this idea that you pray through Jerusalem and the temple to God, right? And you have that in Mem Daled 44 and in 48, again, this idea of Itpalalu elecha derech artzam asher natata la'avotam. This is the idea of when they're exiled, right? This is why, in general, academically, this chapter is considered to have been written after the exile, right? Because it's referring to an exile. It's like when you're exiled and yet in your hearts you return to God, what will you do? They will pray to you, God, through their land which you gave to their forefathers, the city that you chose, and the house which I built to your name. And what's interesting here, of course, is the idea that before in verse 44, the nation is in its land. So they pray through Jerusalem to God. And in verse 48, they're outside of their land. So they pray through the land of Israel, then through Jerusalem, and then to God, right? So we can all see all the sources here for what later becomes really, established Jewish law. In fact, if we look this is the Gemara, this is the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, Brachot Lamed Aleph, Brachot 31a, okay? And here we have all sorts of sources of halacha that they're taking from Daniel, right? Why should you always pray in a house with windows, right? Why should you should pray 3 times a day, right? I might have thought that one could pray as many times as he wishes throughout the entire day. But no, Daniel says 3 times a day, right? I might have thought that this practice began only when he came to the Babylonian exile, but it was stated just as he had done before. They're actually looking at everything in this verse, say, look, this is how we learn what you could do in prayer. We know that it came from before the exile because it says that Daniel always did this. Okay, what's interesting, of course, and one thing I'm not saying here, I'm not saying that this is actually where the rule came from. There was already this practice of praying. Now, you might say, oh, I see there's a whole conversation going on that I'm missing, but just a second. There's one thing we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because sometimes people ask, what about the Dead Sea Scrolls? In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see that they're praying at least twice a day. They're praying in the morning with dawn, and they're praying in the evening with dusk, right? Which would kind of make sense. There's even an indication of that in the Gemara and the Talmud, because it talks about how we have when there are two reasons given for having three prayers in the Talmud. One is that the Avot, the forefathers, set it up like Avram did Shacharit, the morning prayer, Yitzchak did Mincha, the afternoon prayer, and Yaakov did Ma'ariv, the evening prayer. And the other explanation is that it's in parallel to the sacrifices. And then they have to find a reason for the evening prayer, because there aren't really evening sacrifices. And they're like, well, it's for the stuff that's still burning. And they have to kind of, it's a stretch, right? So it feels like the morning and the afternoon, and the afternoon prayer is really the dusk prayer, right? So it's the morning dawn and the afternoon dusk prayer that have a kind of a firmer footing, and then the evening prayer is added on. I see there are a lot of questions here. I will, in fact, look at the whole here. So Danny or Libby say, why would the king agree to make this law? They don't even give any argument in favor of it. And you would think it would have upset many other people in the empire too. Oh, this is Libby's question. Okay. I believe historical documents show no evidence that the ruling that the king's law can never be annulled ever actually existed except in biblical sources. Right. I'm sorry. Yeah. You're like, no, it had nothing to do with it. Okay, fine. Guys. Okay, I'm going to address.
Sorry, we were having a bit of a disconnect in marital communication here.
It's fine. It's fine. I'm always happy to come in with my great consulting wisdom for marital with communication. But anyway, I can come in. I can at least come in and talk about this. So yeah, I think part of what it's reflecting here is what we talked about when we quoted. The Greek source, where it's talking about, oh, he made this decision in anger, and then he regretted it the next morning, and it was too late. This idea of a king who, and we see it also in Esther, this idea that Persian kings, they may be good at some stuff, but they seem to be kind of impulsive. They seem to be kind of impulsive and easily swayed. And they're going to regret it later, but they don't seem to be the most logical when you kind of need them to be logical. And that's a kind of a repeating theme with Persian kings, at least the way people write about Persian kings. And I think that's part of what's going on here. And in fact, right, there's no historical document about a rule like this ever, that you cannot reverse a law. There is in the Hammurabi Code, there is a place where he says you're not allowed, if a judge makes a ruling, he can't reverse the ruling. But that's very different, and you can understand why you would make a law like that, as opposed to making a law of the land that can't be reversed or broken, right? And we've talked about the role of the king in Israelite/Judean tradition, where the king's role is when applying the law as is would be unjust, you can go to the king. And the king will be like, oh, I see that in this case, the law would lead to an unjust outcome. And I am the king, and I'm going to make a different, I'm going to make a different ruling here. And the setup here is that a king can't do that, right? That a king can't overrule the law that he himself signed into existence. And you can understand why that wouldn't be a very common thing that you would find in history.
I'm asking, why would the king agree to a law that says that nobody's allowed to pray for a month? That doesn't seem, they don't argue in favor of it. They give no explanation for it. And the country is full of people with lots of religions who probably pray, and you wouldn't think anybody.
Right, no, it's a completely unreasonable thing to agree to, but it does, the idea seems to be it to show the king's greatness, right? No one's praying to anyone but the king, right? That's the implication. It's not super underlined, but that seems to be the implication, that the idea is make a rule so that everyone will show their loyalty to the king this way, right? Everyone will, and you could understand that would be precisely the sort of suck-uppy type thing that these advisors would do in order to trap Daniel, right? Like, you're so great, make a rule that for 30 days, no one can ask for anything for anyone but you, right? Only you. You are the center of the universe. That's what we need. That'll show everyone's loyalty, like that. Now they don't have a big argument about it, but that seems to be the implication. That the implication is that it's to show loyalty and essentially worship of the king.
You'd think there would be a lot of objections to that, not just.
That's why you don't see it. Like, historically, this is not something you see ever. Again, even for the kings that do these religious revolutions, like Akhenaten, like Babylon, like our Babylonian buddy, who now I've forgotten his name. They all. How could I have forgotten his name? Someone help me. The Babylonian king sent himself into exile, has his own chronicle. Oh no, this is not good.
Hammurabi?
No, not Hammurabi. The late Babylonian king, the last Babylonian king. No. Last year, hold on. What? Last Babylonian king. Just a second. I will find Nabonidus. Nabonidus. Yes, Nabonidus. Okay. Starting again. Good. Okay. So it's Nabonidus. So essentially, even a king who puts into force some kind of religious revolution, like Nabonidus with his worship of sin, or like Akhenaten with his worship of the Aten, right? They don't actually shut down worship of any other god. They might try to shut it down in the capital. They might try to shut it down really central worship, but they're not going to shut down every temples. And Akhenaten, Nabonidus, they still supported, out your far-flung temples. They still supported worship of other gods, because you couldn't just cut everyone off. I mean, Akhenaten cut certain priesthoods off, but not everyone. And because he would have this general revolution. Now, especially in the Persian, and thank you for bringing this up, especially in the Persian Empire, which was known for being a very understanding empire when it came to worship of different gods in different places. And it came in terms of different laws that different nations wanted to apply, their whole approach was to allow these different nations to kind of rule themselves in a certain way, have a certain amount of autonomy, and certainly autonomous worship. And to support that autonomous worship, it would be a very, very strange thing to do in the Persian kingdom. Certainly for 30 days, it's almost asking for rebellion. Like, it's really not the sort of move you would make. It could be more reasonable in the capital city. It could be a more reasonable thing to say, I'm doing this in the capital city where I, the king, reside. That might make a little bit more sense. And that you could see, like, if you just had that, like, if you could just insert that in the verse, that would make the whole story a lot more reasonable, because then you would say, okay, in the capital city itself, where the king is, for 30 days, all worship is shut down. And then Daniel has the same problem, right? That he must worship, right? Now, again, note the different stakes here. In theory, you could say, well, if your life is in danger, Daniel, maybe just cool it for a month, right? At least if you're praying, maybe don't do it next to an open window. Maybe that's what you could do. Yeah, we know it's better to pray to a window, right? Where else do we see? Another place that we see someone praying to a window is actually in the book of Tobit, which is also a book that at least we have from the Second Temple period. Exactly when it was composed is not clear. Probably could be during the Persian period. But in Tobit, the poor woman who has a demon in love with her, who's regularly killing off her bridegrooms, she turns to the window and prays to God, right? Because that's apparently how your prayers are going to go. So we can see that there is also this general idea that you pray towards a window. At the same time, if you've got a rule that's gone out, don't pray, maybe keep the window closed this time. Maybe do it next to a wall, right? But no. This is what Daniel has always done. And he's going to continue praying 3 times a day. We can action again to the decrees of Antiochus, where Antiochus was shutting things down more than requiring worship. He was shutting down worship more than requiring another kind of worship. Okay, and so the response is no, you cannot allow yourself to be shut down. You must hold fast. Okay, back to our text. Oh, wrong one. Here we go. Okay. What did I want to bring the psalm for? Let me see. Oh, here. Yeah, this is important also. I forgot to bring this. So in Psalm 55, Tehillim Nun Hey, right? You also have that the Erev Avoker v'Tzaharayim Asicha ve'emeh, right? Evening and morning and noon, I will speak and moan, right? Vayishma koli, and God will hear my voice. So that's also the idea of praying, that you could take praying 3 times a day. And in fact, the Talmud, the Gemara does in fact say, and that's how we know David prayed 3 times a day, right? So, okay, going back to Daniel, who is praying, right? So he's praying, his windows were open. It says it's not clear, were they? Yeah, okay, so his windows were open and he's praying towards Jerusalem. He's praying 3 times a day. And these guys who set this whole thing up to catch Daniel to begin with, they know where to look, right? Honestly. Right? So they came, and again, tumultuously, hargishu, they came like, it does seem in a tumult. And also, again, I think there is a hint that maybe this is used in particularly in connection to conspiracies. And they found Daniel, this word, and they found Daniel praying and begging before God. Okay. Bedayin kribu v'amrin kadam malka al esar malka hal esar shamtal di chol enash di yif'ei min kol elav enash ad yom intzlatin lehen minach malka. Right. So he said that they come close, but it also krivu, it also means it's almost like a court case. They bring this kind of as an evidence, and they say before the king, they said, hey, the king had his prohibition. You wrote a prohibition that all people who've asked anything from any god or people for 30 days, except from the king, they'll be thrown into the pit of lions. Anei Malkava Amar Yatziva Milta Kedat Madaya Faras Dilat Hede. And the king says, it's true, and I can't change it as the rules of Mede and Persia. I can't change the Media and Persia, the Medes and the Persians. I cannot change the law. They already said, okay, remember that there's this law, and he's like, yep, you're right, and I can't change it. They're like, aha. So then they proclaimed and said, Kadam Malka, before the king, Di Daniel di min bnei galuta di Yehud la sam alach malka te'eh. Right? So he's they say that Daniel, who's from the exiles of Judea, he doesn't give a darn about you, the king, or your laws, right? But he was praying his prayers 3 times a day. He doesn't care. He's you know, he's like, it's like he's spitting at you. Like he doesn't care anything about you. Now, note what the story is. He doesn't get angry. The Nebuchadnezzar got incensed at the 3 friends, and he threw them in the fire. He wanted them dead. The king is this king is a little bit different, right? Adayin Malka Kidimal Milta Shema. When the king heard these words, Sagi be'esh alo, he was in a really bad mood. Ve'al Daniel Sambal l'shezavute. He wanted to save Daniel, right? He tried to save Daniel. So he tried to find a way till sunset of somehow saving Daniel, right? I want to assume some kind of looking for some kind of legal out. Bedayin Guraya Ilech hargishu malka b'amru malka da malka didat lemadei varas tichol asaru kem di malka yihakem lale ashnai. And then they come and they remind him, listen, you remember, you can't change any law, right? You signed the law into existence, that's it. You can't change it now, right? And so you're stuck, Your Majesty, right? Beidayin malka amar v'haitiv Daniel uremo leguba didayavata. And so then the king said, and they commands or agrees. They bring Daniel and they throw him, in fact, into the pit of lions. Ane makava amar Daniel elahach di ant palach le betidira hu yishezvinach. He said to him, God, who you serve so consistently, he shall save you. Now you can actually read this a little bit. It's maybe a little sarcastic, right? Oh, the God that you pray to so consistently, he'll save you now, right? You can kind of say that maybe it's a little bit of a remark that, you didn't pray to me, and I'm putting you in with the lions. So let's see the God that you did pray to. Let's see him save you. Okay. However, it does seem that it does seem that he is really upset about Daniel dying. Okay. And they bring a stone, and they put it on the mouth of the pit. Remember, we always call it a lion's den, but what's being described here is a pit, and you have a stone placed on the mouth of the pit. Now, we don't know of any place where lions are kept that way. If you're familiar at all with the Assyrian, if you've been to the British Museum and you've seen those Assyrian, what do you call it, tavlit in English? Like not an inscription,
relief.
A relief. Thank you. If you've seen the Assyrian reliefs of, as the Assyrian kings would as a standard practice, they'd have these caged lions that then would be released, and they'd chase them down and catch them and kill them. And you see those lions in cages. You don't see them in pits ever. We don't know of lions being in pits. There are. Delilah and Hartman brought up maybe, like if you think about like with the gladiators, the Roman gladiators, and then there they kept like the lions kind of underground, whatever. It's interesting because I saw an Akkadian letter, which it was being brought actually in the context of Daniel, and where an advisor is being saddened that he's at the mouth of the lions. And it was being translated there as den. It's actually a word that's used more for hill, but maybe in Neo-Assyrian the meaning changes. But the root was if you did it in Hebrew, would be Gimel Bet Aleph. So it was actually pretty close to this word here that we have as a pit, right? And it was being used in the context of this is where the lions are, right? So that's an interesting that was an interesting parallel. So maybe it means something. Maybe that's also a connection. Maybe it was hinting to some kind of similar setup for keeping lions. So, I didn't share my screen. Hold on. One moment. Okay. V'chatma malka b'izkitei. Right, and he actually seals him in with his ring, right? So, or with his signet, whatever he uses to sign things, right? And so do all the officers, right? Because they want to make sure no one's breaking this guy out. All right, no one's breaking this guy out. He is sealed in, right? Now it's easy to break clay, but then someone broke the clay, right? Someone messed with it, right? So this way he sealed it. Right? So he went and he didn't eat, they didn't bring, and this is the question, what did they not bring before him? Possibly a table. There's an old earlier commentary say a concubine. He didn't let himself, he didn't celebrate, he didn't enjoy himself. He was essentially being ascetic for a night, right? So he didn't eat, he didn't have fun. Vishintena data lohi, and his sleep wandered. Again, that's, his sleep fled from him. Again, that's another parallel to the Megillah, to Esther, where we know Nadadesh Nata Melech, where the king can't sleep. But in this case, the reason he can't sleep is because he's upset about Daniel, right? Because he really wanted to save Daniel. He tried, remember, all day to save Daniel. He didn't have a choice. He threw him into the lion's pit. He had to seal him in, and now he can't sleep. I think that he doesn't think that he's going to be saved, right? I think that's the interpretation. I think he was being a little ironic when he said, "Oh, the God that you pray to so frequently, he'll save you." I don't think we're meant to think that he actually believes it. He doesn't believe it. He's like, yeah, well, you pray to him, like, yeah, he should save you, and he's not expecting it. Beidayin Malka, Bishbar Para Yikum Minagha. He gets up at the break of dawn, right? It has dawn kind of twice in the sentence. And he quickly goes to the pit of lions, right, to see what happened. Daniel Allah di'an halachla b'tadira haychal shezavutach min ayavata, and when he comes close, he calls he cries out in this sad voice. He says, Daniel, who serves the living God, the God that you worship so consistently, was he able to save you from the lions? And dying Daniel in Malka Malil Malka La'almin Chayi. And said, Daniel says to the king, may you live forever. That's a great response, right? It's just very dramatic. We have the whole setup. The dialogue's perfect. It's great for a movie. But it really sets up the whole thing. Like, he's like, Daniel, did your living God save you? And he's like, yeah, God, yeah, king, may you live forever. In other words, I'm fine. May you live forever, right? Elahi shlach malache. Right, so God sent an angel. Remember that in the Second Temple period, particularly, God is made much more distant, and miracles are done through angels, right? But even before, honestly, in general, miracles, a lot of the miracles on earth are kind of done through some kind of angelic intervention, particularly when it has to do with people and kings. So he said God sent an angel, and the angel shut the lions' mouths, and they couldn't hurt me. He points out the reason is because I was found innocent. I didn't deserve anything to happen to me, right? Both before God and before you, my king. I've not done anything to hurt you. And I think this is also hinting that the fact that I prayed to God didn't mean I'm not loyal to you, right? I prayed to God, but I'm still loyal to you. I didn't mean any disrespect to you by praying to God. Beidayin Malka Sagiti Eva Lohi Daniel Amar Lahansaka min Guba Vusak Daniel min Guba V'chol Chaval So the king was really, really happy, and he had Daniel taken out of the pit, and Daniel was taken up out of the pit. There was no wound or anything found on him because he believed in God. He trusted in God. V'amar Malka, okay, now of course we have, what's going to happen to all those guys who accused Daniel. V'amar Malka v'haitiv guvraya ilech diachalu kartsohi di Daniel ulgovaya vata remo inun b'nehon uneshehon. Right, the king had all the men who accused Daniel. He had them cast into the pit of lions, them and their wives and their children. Right, because they can't just be them. It's their whole families. They are just going to be wiped out, right? Like, they didn't get to the bottom of the pit. Like, they're being dropped, right? So they're being dropped into the pit, and on their way down, all the lions go, rah, right? And they don't reach the bottom of the pit before they're eaten, right? And all their bones are smashed, all right? Just so you understand, and this description is meant for you to understand that Daniel's salvation really was miraculous, right? In other words, the lions, it's not that the lions are peaceful lions, it's not that the lions aren't hungry, it's that Daniel was protected by an angel. These guys are not, and the lions don't wait a second before they absolutely destroy them. Okay, I can smile and laugh because I don't mean to be like evil. Okay, I just think that the description is very vivid. Okay,
Daniel's enemies were simply in the control group.
Yeah, I like that. So Bedayin Dayabash Maka, Kitab L'cha Amamaya Umaya V'lishanaya, Di Dairin B'cha Arash Shlamchon Iske. Okay, so then Darius wrote this kind of official letter to all the peoples, language, and nations and languages. And again, this idea of writing a letter to everyone, we see this a lot in Esther. We see this again as a theme when people talk about the Persian kingdom, again, because it was so impressive the way that they would send letters through their whole kingdom. This is something that Greeks frequently write about the Persians. In other words, it's just a matter of wonder. So these letters take a very central role. So he writes a letter to everyone, and he starts with Shlamchon Yiskei. May you all have much peace. Min kadamai simteim divcho shaltan machuti lavon zayin v'dachal min kadam elahi Daniel. Okay, let everyone in the kingdom fear the God of Daniel. This is a little bit similar to what Nebuchadnezzar says at the end of the story with Daniel's three friends. Dihu elaha chaya v'kayam la'almin u'malchutei dilat titchabal v'shaltanei ad sofa. But this kind of declaration of belief is not found there. So here we have this kind of, why should you worship Daniel's God? Not just because Daniel's God, saved Daniel, because he is the living God. He exists forever, and his kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule is till the end. Right? Right? He delivers and rescues. He makes he works signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. For he saved Daniel from the lions. And Daniel prospered and in the kingdom of Darius and in the kingdom of Cyrus the Persian. And here it's kind of the introduction to say, okay, first you have Darius and then you have Cyrus, right? And again, part of it is to kind of create this other kingdom of the Medes, and possibly in order to get that four kingdoms, you want to get to the four kingdoms. But at any rate, what we have here is we have this declaration of belief from the Persian king that really sets up like, okay, this is what you need to do. And again, it kind of brings us back to the role to what the book of Daniel says about the role of the Jew. And I am saying, and I know it's kind of stereotyped, but the role of the Jew in a foreign court and in the foreign system. What is the role of the Jew? The role of the Jew is to stay steadfast to the laws of his fathers, to the worship of his God, and thereby to bring everyone to understand the greatness of God, right? And to bring everyone to this belief in God, right? And that's the promise, right? The promise is if you hold steadfast, and everyone will recognize that this is the living God who will never be destroyed. Anyone who wants to see a relief of the Assyrian lion hunt, Robin's got it as his background. So take a look. And I'm going to, but at any rate, I hope that was clear in terms of what this story says about kind of the approach. And remember that this story is almost certainly written in response to the decrees of Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Where the idea is someone's telling us not to worship God, They're not necessarily, they're making it, it's not, so it might not be so hard to avoid these decrees by just not worshiping. But no, you must worship God. And the promise is that then there will be a recognition. And of course, it's already been underlined by the previous stories, which keep on telling us that it's God who rules and not these kings. These kings will come and go, and it's God who has the power. And then the next step is, well, even if the king says, no, I must worship God. And through that, everyone will recognize the power of God. Okay. So next week, please don't kill me. Next week, we don't have class because I have something I have to be at, and we won't be able to have class next week. We will pick up the following week. Look forward to Daniel's apocalypses. We're going to get really into the weeds. However, we're going to be coming out of our Aramaic very soon. Not next week, but soon. We will be back to Hebrew.